Story 1. The Breath Stealer. Victoria Hayes was a 44-year-old respiratory therapist from Cleveland who had spent 20 years helping patients breathe, understanding the mechanics of respiration, the critical importance of each breath. In March 2016, while hiking through Tennessee, Victoria encountered something on the trail that began stealing her breaths. Not metaphorically, but literally taking individual breaths from her, removing them from her lungs after she inhaled them, leaving her gasping not from exertion but from having her respiration physically extracted by something she couldn't see but could feel pulling air from inside her chest. Victoria was on a 6-day solo hike in excellent cardiovascular condition with no respiratory issues. She had helped thousands of patients with breathing difficulties and understood lung function better than most doctors. Her own breathing was effortless, automatic, something she never thought about beyond her professional interest. On the third day, while resting at a scenic overlook, Victoria took a deep breath to appreciate the view. The air went into her lungs normally, but then something took it, not expelled through normal exhalation, taken, pulled from her lungs by an external force, extracted as if someone had reached into her chest and removed the air she had just inhaled. Victoria gasped, shocked by the sensation. She took another breath and again it was taken, pulled from her lungs midway through the inhalation, stolen before she could utilize the oxygen. She stood there breathing rapidly, trying to get air into her lungs, but approximately every third breath was being taken, removed by something she couldn't identify. Her professional training provided no framework for this. Respiration was involuntary, controlled by the respiratory center in the brainstem, regulated by carbon dioxide levels in the blood. There was no mechanism by which individual breaths could be externally removed from functioning lungs. Yet it was happening, undeniably and repeatedly. Victoria tried to analyze the sensation. It felt like something was drawing air from her lungs through suction, creating negative pressure that pulled the air out against her body's will. Not through her mouth or nose, the air wasn't being exhaled normally. It was being extracted, pulled through her chest wall somehow, removed from inside her body without passing through the normal respiratory passages. By evening, the breath stealing had intensified. Now every other breath was being taken, leaving Victoria in constant respiratory distress. She would inhale, have that breath stolen, inhale again, have that breath stolen, creating a pattern where she was breathing twice as frequently to get half the air she needed. Her oxygen saturation was dropping. Her pulse oximeter confirmed it. Despite breathing rapidly and deeply, despite her lungs functioning normally, she was becoming hypoxic because half her breaths were being stolen before the oxygen could be absorbed into her bloodstream. Victoria tried various respiratory techniques: pursed lip breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, controlled breathing exercises she taught to patients. Nothing prevented the stealing. Whatever was taking her breaths didn't care about her technique, didn't respond to her attempts to control or protect her respiration. By the fourth day, Victoria was in severe distress. 3 out of 4 breaths were being stolen now, leaving her with only 25% of her normal respiration. Her lips were turning blue from hypoxia. Her mental function was declining from lack of oxygen. Her body was failing despite her lungs working perfectly. The air just wasn't staying in them long enough to be useful. She tried to hike out to reach help, but moving while severely hypoxic was nearly impossible. Victoria collapsed repeatedly, gasping, trying desperately to breathe, but having most of her breath stolen the moment air entered her lungs. Other hikers found her in respiratory distress and called for emergency evacuation. Paramedics arrived and immediately tried to provide supplemental oxygen, placing a mask over Victoria's face and running high-flow oxygen into her lungs. But the oxygen was stolen too. The paramedics watched in confusion as their oxygen delivery system showed flow going into the patient, but her oxygen saturation didn't improve. Victoria was breathing supplemental oxygen but not benefiting from it because the breaths were being taken, stolen, removed from her lungs before the oxygen could be absorbed. At the hospital, doctors were baffled. Victoria's lungs were healthy, her respiratory mechanics were normal, but she was severely hypoxic despite being on maximum supplemental oxygen. Chest X-rays showed nothing unusual. Blood gases showed severe oxygen deprivation. But there was no medical explanation for why oxygen wasn't reaching her bloodstream. Then a nurse noticed something impossible. Victoria's chest would expand with inhalation. The ventilator would deliver oxygen, but her chest would suddenly deflate slightly without any corresponding exhalation through the breathing tube. The air was being removed from her lungs internally, extracted somehow without passing through the normal respiratory pathways. Medical staff watched in horror as this pattern repeated. Breath delivered, breath stolen, delivered, stolen. Victoria was breathing but not retaining any air, was receiving oxygen but not keeping it, was being ventilated but still suffocating because something was stealing her breaths faster than they could be delivered. They tried everything. Different ventilator settings, paralytic drugs to eliminate any patient contribution to the problem, even chest tubes thinking perhaps air was escaping into her chest cavity. Nothing worked. The breaths continued being stolen. After 2 days, Victoria went into cardiac arrest from prolonged hypoxia. They resuscitated her, but brain damage from oxygen deprivation was severe. Victoria survived, but with cognitive impairment from the period when her breaths were being stolen faster than oxygen could be delivered. Months later, partially recovered, Victoria tried to explain what had happened. She described the sensation of having air pulled from inside her chest, stolen by something external. Medical professionals attributed this to her oxygen-deprived brain creating false perceptions, to hypoxic hallucinations, to her desperate mind trying to make sense of unexplained respiratory failure. But Victoria knew the difference between perception and reality. Something had stolen her breaths, had taken air from her lungs, had extracted her respiration physically and literally. The damage to her brain from the prolonged oxygen deprivation was real, objective, measurable. The consequence of having her breathing stolen systematically until her body could no longer function. She never hiked again. She left her respiratory therapy career, unable to help patients breathe when her own breathing remained vulnerable. Even now, years later, Victoria occasionally has breath stolen. Not every breath like on the trail, but random individual breaths taken suddenly, extracted from her lungs as a reminder that something on that Tennessee trail took her respiration and never fully returned it. She feels it happen. The sudden extraction, the air being pulled from inside her chest, the gasp as her body tries to replace the stolen breath. It happens perhaps once a week now. A single breath taken. A reminder of those days when 3 out of 4 breaths were stolen and she nearly died from having her respiration systematically extracted. Victoria has tried to warn other hikers, particularly those with respiratory expertise who might think their knowledge would protect them. But her warnings sound like the confused testimony of someone whose brain was damaged by oxygen deprivation. Someone whose credibility was destroyed by the same event she's trying to warn others about. She knows that somewhere on that Tennessee trail something steals breaths, something takes air from hikers' lungs, something extracts respiration physically and literally. Most hikers probably lose only a few breaths, experience it as brief breathlessness they attribute to exertion or altitude. But for Victoria, who stayed in that area too long, who breathed there for days, the stealing escalated until it nearly killed her. Until it damaged her brain through systematic oxygen deprivation, until it proved that respiration is not as involuntary and protected as respiratory therapists believe, that breathing can be taken from you, that air can be stolen from inside your lungs, and that something on the trail knows how to extract the breath from your chest, taking it breath by breath until you suffocate despite having healthy lungs and functioning respiratory mechanics, dying not from inability to breathe, but from having your breathing stolen, your respiration extracted, your breaths taken one by one until none remain. Story 2. The Hunger That Feeds. Dennis Hartman was a 50-year-old nutritionist from Baltimore who understood hunger, understood the physiological signals of nutritional need, understood how the body regulated appetite and satiety. In July 2018, while section hiking through Maryland, Dennis experienced real hunger for the first time in his life. Not the manageable appetite of someone who has missed a meal, but genuine starvation-level hunger, the kind that consumes thought and motivation. What Dennis discovered was that feeling hungry can make you become food. That starvation from the inside out transforms you into something edible, and that hunger intense enough will eventually feed on the hungry person themselves. Dennis had planned his food carefully, carrying exactly calculated calories for his 5-day hike with a safety margin. He was never hungry in normal life, had always maintained perfect nutrition, had taught others how to manage appetite and maintain healthy eating patterns. On the second day, Dennis felt hunger that seemed disproportionate to his nutritional state. He had eaten his planned breakfast just 3 hours ago, had adequate calories on board, but felt ravenous, desperately hungry, as if he hadn't eaten in days. Dennis's nutritionist training told him this was impossible. He had consumed adequate calories, his blood sugar should be stable. His body had no reason to signal extreme hunger. Yet the feeling persisted and intensified. Painful, gnawing, all-consuming hunger that made it difficult to think about anything except eating. He ate more than planned, consuming extra food to satisfy the hunger. But within an hour, the ravenous feeling returned, worse than before. Dennis ate again, going through his safety margin, burning through food supplies faster than his plan allowed. By evening of the second day, Dennis had consumed 3 days' worth of food but felt hungrier than he had at the start. His stomach felt empty despite being objectively full. His body was signaling starvation despite adequate caloric intake. The hunger was operating independent of his actual nutritional state, demanding more food regardless of how much he consumed. Dennis tried to understand this physiologically. Hunger was regulated by hormones: ghrelin, leptin, insulin. Something must be disrupting his hormonal signaling, creating false hunger signals despite adequate nutrition. But the hunger felt real, not psychosomatic, not a mere signal error, but genuine, desperate need. By the third day, Dennis had eaten all his food and was still ravenously hungry. The hunger was painful now. Sharp cramps in his stomach, weakness in his limbs, cognitive impairment from what felt like advanced starvation. He had been adequately fed less than 12 hours ago, but his body was responding as if it hadn't eaten in weeks. Other hikers shared food with him, concerned by his gaunt appearance. Dennis didn't understand how he could look starved after only 2 days of hiking with adequate food, but his reflection in his phone's camera showed someone severely malnourished. Sunken cheeks, prominent bones, skin stretched tight over skeletal features. Dennis ate everything offered to him, consuming thousands of calories, but the hunger only intensified. His body was burning through calories at impossible rates, or perhaps not utilizing the food he consumed, or maybe the hunger was creating physical changes independent of actual nutrition. By the fourth day, Dennis looked like he had been starving for months. His body had consumed its fat reserves, was catabolizing muscle tissue, was showing signs of advanced malnutrition. He was weak, dizzy, confused, displaying all the symptoms of severe starvation despite having consumed enormous quantities of food over the past 48 hours. More disturbing, Dennis started to smell appetizing. Not his normal body odor, but a smell like cooking meat, like prepared food. Other hikers would approach him and involuntarily comment on a pleasant smell, asking if someone was cooking nearby. Not realizing the smell was coming from Dennis himself. Dennis realized what was happening. The hunger was transforming him, making him into food, changing his physical composition from living human tissue into something edible. He was being prepared, rendered appetizing, transformed by the hunger from eater into eaten. The hunger intensified further, becoming unbearable, all-consuming. Dennis's thoughts were entirely occupied by food, by the desperate need to eat, by hunger that transcended normal physiological limits. And beneath that hunger, he felt something else, a sense that he himself was becoming more edible, more food-like, more ready to be consumed. He collapsed on the trail, too weak to continue, his body starved despite days of excessive eating. Rangers found him in critical condition, showing signs of advanced malnutrition that should take weeks or months to develop, not days. At the hospital, Dennis was started on aggressive nutritional support, but his body didn't respond normally. The calories he consumed seemed to pass through him without being absorbed, or perhaps were being consumed by something else, something that fed on both the food he ate and on Dennis himself. Doctors watched his condition deteriorate despite maximum nutritional intervention. He continued to appear increasingly starved, his body consuming itself, his tissues breaking down as if experiencing prolonged famine despite receiving adequate calories intravenously. Then the phenomenon reversed. After 2 weeks of decline, Dennis's body suddenly started retaining nutrition, started rebuilding muscle and fat, started recovering. The hunger receded, becoming normal appetite again. Within a month, Dennis looked healthy, all signs of starvation reversed. But Dennis had changed. He couldn't feel normal hunger anymore. The experience of that consuming, transformative hunger had damaged his ability to experience appetite at normal levels. He ate mechanically now, on schedule, without ever feeling the need to eat. His body's hunger signaling had been destroyed by experiencing hunger so intense it had nearly consumed him. More disturbing, Dennis retained the smell. Faintly but perceptibly, he smelled appetizing, like prepared food rather than living human. The hunger had partially transformed him, had made him slightly more edible than he had been, and that transformation was permanent. Dennis left his nutrition practice, unable to counsel others about hunger when his own relationship with appetite had been destroyed. He eats now without pleasure, without desire, mechanically consuming calories to maintain function because his hunger signaling was burned out by experiencing hunger intense enough to begin transforming him into food. Sometimes Dennis feels it returning. The beginning of that consuming hunger, the edge of the transformation that would render him edible. When he feels it starting, he eats immediately, floods his system with calories, trying to satisfy the hunger before it can progress to the level where it starts feeding on him, where it transforms him from eater into eaten, where it makes him appetizing to something that feeds not on external food, but on the hungry themselves, consuming those who feel hunger intensely enough to begin the transformation. Story 3: The Distance That Stretches. Karen Liu was a 37-year-old surveyor from Richmond who understood distance, who measured it professionally, who knew with precision how far things were from each other. In September 2017, while hiking through Virginia, Karen walked from one shelter to the next, a distance listed as 3.2 miles in every guidebook, a distance she measured personally with GPS, a distance that should take about 90 minutes. What Karen discovered was that some distances are not fixed, that miles can stretch, and that walking through space that expands as you traverse it can trap you in ever-growing distances that increase faster than you can cover them. Karen approached the day's hike with her usual precision. The guidebook clearly stated 3.2 miles from one shelter to the next. Her GPS confirmed this distance. It was a simple, straightforward section that should be easy and quick. She started hiking at 8 a.m., maintaining her normal pace of about 2 miles per hour. By 10 a.m., she should be at the next shelter. Karen tracked her progress with professional attention, watching her GPS log the distance covered. By 10 a.m., Karen had covered 2.1 miles according to her GPS. She should have only 1.1 miles remaining, should be able to see the shelter soon. But when she checked the distance remaining on her GPS, it showed 2.3 miles to the shelter. The total distance had increased, no longer 3.2 miles but 4.4 miles, as if the destination had moved further away while she was walking toward it. Karen stopped and recalibrated her GPS, thinking there was a technical error. But the reading remained consistent. She had traveled 2.1 miles and had 2.3 miles remaining, totaling 4.4 miles for a section that should be 3.2 miles. She continued hiking, watching her GPS carefully. After covering another mile, now 3.1 miles from her starting point, Karen checked the distance remaining. It showed 2.8 miles to the shelter. The total distance was now 5.9 miles. The destination was moving away from her faster than she could approach it. Karen tried to understand this geometrically. In normal space, distance was fixed. If point A and point B were 3.2 miles apart, traveling from A toward B should decrease the distance by the amount traveled. But the space between her and the shelter was expanding, growing faster than she could cover it, stretching as she walked through it. By noon, Karen had covered over 5 miles but still had 4 miles remaining to the shelter. The 3.2-mile section had expanded to 9 miles and continued growing. She was trapped in space that stretched, in distance that increased, in a geometric impossibility that her surveying expertise couldn't explain. Karen tried going faster, thinking perhaps if she covered distance more quickly, the expansion wouldn't exceed her speed. But the space seemed to expand in proportion to her effort. The faster she walked, the faster the distance increased, maintaining a gap she couldn't close. By afternoon, Karen had covered over 10 miles but remained approximately 4 miles from the shelter. The distance didn't decrease regardless of how far she walked. She was effectively on a treadmill, covering ground without making progress, walking through space that expanded to negate her movement. Other hikers passed her going the opposite direction, heading from the shelter she was trying to reach back toward the shelter she had started from. Karen asked how far it was between shelters. 3.2 miles, they confirmed. Easy section, took us about 90 minutes. Karen tried to follow their route backward, thinking perhaps approaching from the opposite direction would work. But when she turned around and hiked south, the distance to the shelter behind her increased too. Both shelters were now moving away from her, both distances expanding, trapping her in a stretch of trail that was growing in both directions. She was caught in the middle of distance that stretched infinitely, unable to reach either end, trapped in space that expanded faster than she could traverse it. Karen hiked for hours, covering enormous distances but never getting closer to either shelter, never making progress toward any destination. As darkness fell, Karen had covered over 20 miles since morning but was still approximately 4 miles from the nearest shelter in either direction. She had walked continuously for 12 hours through a 3.2-mile section without completing it, without reaching any endpoint, trapped in distance that grew faster than she could cover it. Karen set up her tent in frustration and exhaustion. She had failed at the simple task of walking 3.2 miles, had been defeated by distance that shouldn't be able to defeat someone who measured and understood distance professionally. The next morning, Karen tried a different approach. Instead of trying to reach a destination, she walked without checking GPS, without monitoring distance, without thinking about how far she had to go. She simply hiked, paying attention to the trail itself rather than the distance remaining. After about 2 hours of this mindless hiking, Karen looked up and saw the shelter. She had covered the remaining distance by not measuring it. by not quantifying it, by not treating it as a problem to be calculated. The moment she stopped measuring the distance, it stopped stretching. Karen reached the shelter, shaken by the experience. She had spent over a day covering 3.2 miles, had walked over 20 miles through a section that should take 90 minutes. The distance had stretched because she measured it, had expanded because she treated it precisely, had grown because her surveying instincts had tried to quantify it. She completed the rest of her hike without using GPS, without checking distances, without measuring her progress. Every time she started quantifying distance, she felt it beginning to stretch, felt the space expanding in response to her measurement. Only by walking without measuring, by moving without calculating, by covering distance without quantifying it, could she traverse space normally. Karen never worked as a surveyor again. She couldn't trust distance anymore, couldn't measure it without fearing it would stretch in response to measurement. She had learned that some distances are not fixed, that measurement can affect what's being measured, that treating distance precisely can make it expand, can trap you in space that grows faster than you can cover it, can turn a 3.2-mile walk into an endless journey through distance that stretches infinitely, expanding forever just beyond your ability to reach it, keeping you always approaching but never arriving, always measuring the gap but never closing it, always walking through space that expands faster than you can traverse it, leaving you trapped in distance that has no end, in miles that multiply, in space that stretches forever in response to your attempt to measure and quantify and control it through the precision that should reduce uncertainty but instead creates infinite expansion. Story 4: The Shadow That Walks. Michelle Torres was a 49-year-old optical physicist from Atlanta who understood light, understood shadow formation, understood the physics of illumination and darkness. In June 2021, while hiking through Georgia, Michelle noticed her shadow was walking incorrectly. The movement didn't match her stride, the position didn't align with the sun's angle, the shape didn't conform to perspective rules. What Michelle discovered was that shadows are not always mere absence of light, that sometimes they have independence, and that a shadow that walks wrong is warning you that it's learning, practicing, preparing to separate completely and walk away carrying some essential part of you that cannot survive the separation. Michelle had noticed the anomaly on her second day. The sun was at a specific angle that should cast her shadow in a particular direction, but the shadow fell at a slightly different angle, only a few degrees off, but enough for someone with her expertise to notice immediately. At first, Michelle assumed it was atmospheric refraction, some optical effect causing light to bend unusually. But as she watched her shadow throughout the day, the discrepancy wasn't consistent with any atmospheric phenomenon. The shadow was positioning itself independently, choosing its own angle regardless of the sun's position. By the third day, the shadow's movements were clearly independent. When Michelle walked, her shadow would sometimes walk in a different direction, or at a different pace, or with a different stride pattern. The shadow was mimicking her movement imperfectly, as if it were learning, practicing, trying to understand how to walk like a separate entity. Michelle tried to explain this optically. Shadows were absence of light, were not physical entities that could have independent movement. They were geometric projections following strict physical rules based on light source position and object geometry. They couldn't deviate from these rules, couldn't move independently, couldn't practice walking. Yet her shadow was doing exactly that. Michelle watched it lag behind her steps, watched it walk with incorrect stride length, watched it move at angles that violated the sun's position. The shadow was becoming autonomous, developing its own movement patterns, separating from the mechanical projection it should be. By day 4, the shadow was walking alongside Michelle rather than beneath or behind her. It projected horizontally on vertical surfaces, appeared on the wrong side of objects, violated every rule of shadow formation. And its movement was becoming more confident, more accurate, more like genuine walking and less like crude mimicry. Michelle tried to photograph the shadow, to document the optical impossibility. But in photographs, the shadow appeared normal, projected correctly according to light physics. The independent movement was visible only to direct observation, not captured by camera. The shadow existed differently in real-time perception than in recorded images. More disturbing, Michelle began to feel depleted. Her energy was draining, her vitality decreasing, as if something essential was being pulled from her. She realized the shadow was taking something as it learned to walk independently, drawing energy or substance or some quality from her that allowed it to become more than mere absence of light. By day 6, the shadow could walk completely independent of Michelle's movement. It would stroll ahead of her on the trail, or lag behind, or take side paths. It maintained a connection to her, couldn't go more than about 30 yards away, but within that radius moved freely, walking with its own stride, its own pace, its own path. Michelle watched her shadow explore the trail ahead of her, watched it examine interesting features, watched it move with increasing independence and confidence. The shadow was becoming a separate entity, using her as an anchor but developing its own autonomy. Then Michelle noticed pieces of herself were fading. Her hands looked slightly translucent in certain light. Her face in reflections seemed less distinct, less clearly defined. The shadow was taking substance from her as it gained independence, was absorbing her reality to fuel its own existence. She tried to reclaim the shadow, to force it back into proper geometric projection, to re-establish control over it. But the shadow resisted, evaded her attempts, maintained its independence. It had learned too much, had gained too much autonomy, had taken too much substance from her to be forced back into mere absence of light. By day 7, Michelle was noticeably translucent. Other hikers looked at her oddly, commented that she seemed less present somehow, that she was hard to focus on. The shadow had taken so much substance from her that she was becoming shadow-like herself, fading toward the absence her shadow had departed from. The shadow, meanwhile, looked increasingly solid. In certain light, it appeared three-dimensional, almost physical, more present than Michelle herself. The substance taken from her was manifesting in the shadow, giving it reality as it drained reality from her. Michelle understood what was happening. The shadow was completing its separation, was taking the final pieces it needed to become fully independent. Once it had taken enough substance, it would detach completely, would walk away as a separate entity, leaving Michelle as a mere shadow herself, as the projection the entity had once been. She tried to stop the process, tried to reclaim her substance from the shadow, tried to prevent the final separation. But she didn't know how. Her optical physics expertise explained light and shadow geometrically, but provided no framework for shadows that walked independently, that took substance from their sources, that prepared to separate and become autonomous. Rangers found Michelle on day 8, barely visible, translucent, fading. Her shadow, however, was clearly visible, solid, walking nearby but independent of her fading form. They watched in confusion as the shadow moved independently, exploring the area while Michelle remained barely perceptible. Medical evacuation was challenging because the paramedics kept losing track of Michelle visually. She was there physically, but so depleted of substance that she was nearly invisible, hard to focus on, difficult to perceive clearly. The shadow, however, remained clearly visible, following the evacuation at a distance, maintaining connection to Michelle despite her fading. At the hospital, doctors struggled to understand Michelle's condition. She appeared translucent, insubstantial, as if she were fading from reality. Tests showed she was physically present. She had mass, had vital signs. But visually, she was barely there, almost invisible in normal light. Michelle tried to explain about the shadow, about the independence it had developed, about the substance it had taken from her. But medical staff dismissed this as delusional, as confusion from whatever medical condition was causing her translucence. Over the following weeks, the process slowly reversed. Michelle gradually became more visible, more substantial, more clearly present. The shadow correspondingly returned to normal projection, lost its independence, became once again mere absence of light following geometric rules. But Michelle knew the separation had been nearly complete, that the shadow had almost taken enough substance to walk away permanently. She had been close to fading entirely, to becoming the shadow, while her shadow became the primary entity. She avoids direct sunlight now, afraid of creating shadows strong enough to resume their independence, afraid of giving them opportunity to practice walking again, to learn autonomy again, to begin taking substance again. She lives in diffuse light, in conditions that create only weak shadows, protecting herself from the danger of shadow separation. Michelle knows that somewhere in Georgia, her shadow still remembers how to walk independently, still retains the movement patterns it learned, still holds some of the substance it took from her. It waits in potential, ready to resume its independence if given opportunity, ready to complete the separation it nearly achieved, ready to walk away as a fully autonomous entity, leaving Michelle as mere shadow behind, teaching through her near transformation that shadows are not always passive projections, that absence of light can become presence of something else, and that walking shadows are practicing for the day they'll walk away completely, taking with them the substance and reality of their sources, leaving behind only shadow forms of the people who once cast them. Story 5. The Accumulator. Robert Finch was a 56-year-old minimalist and decluttering consultant from Portland who had built his career on helping people eliminate excess possessions. He believed passionately in owning less, in the freedom of minimalism, in the burden that possessions create. In May 2019, while hiking through Maine, Robert discovered that decluttering creates vacuum, that emptiness demands filling, and that refusing to carry anything means something else will load you with burdens you cannot declutter, cannot minimize, cannot eliminate, no matter how desperately you practice minimalism. Robert hiked with almost nothing. His base pack weight was under 8 pounds, the absolute minimum gear required for safety. He carried no extras, no luxuries, no non-essential items. His minimalism was extreme, radical, a statement about how little humans actually needed. For the first 3 days, Robert felt vindicated. His light pack made hiking easy. His lack of possessions felt liberating. His minimalism was proving itself superior to the heavily laden hikers struggling past him with overpacked bags. On the 4th day, Robert noticed his pack felt heavier despite containing the same minimal items. He weighed it, now 12 pounds instead of 8. But when he laid out all his gear, it totaled only 8 pounds. The pack weighed more than the sum of its contents. Robert examined the pack carefully, looking for hidden weight. He found nothing visible, but the weight was undeniably present. His pack had gained 4 pounds of something that couldn't be seen or identified. By evening, the pack weighed 16 pounds. Robert emptied it completely, examining every pocket and compartment. Nothing explained the additional weight. The pack itself weighed less than a pound. His gear totaled 8 pounds, but together they weighed 16 pounds. 8 pounds of invisible weight had accumulated in his minimalist pack. Robert tried to understand this physically. Mass didn't appear spontaneously. Weight corresponded to matter. Invisible weight was impossible. Yet his scale confirmed it, his body confirmed it. The pack was heavy with something that wasn't physically present. By day 5, the pack weighed 25 pounds despite containing the same minimal 8 pounds of visible gear. Robert was carrying 17 pounds of invisible weight, of accumulation that violated his minimalism, of burden he couldn't identify or eliminate. The invisible weight continued accumulating daily. By day 7, the pack weighed 40 pounds, 32 pounds of invisible burden added to his minimal 8 pounds of gear. Robert's minimalist philosophy was being mocked by invisible accumulation he couldn't declutter. More disturbing, the invisible weight was organized. Robert could feel distinct items in his pack, could sense the shapes of objects that weren't visibly present. His hand would encounter resistance in empty pockets, would feel the form of something where nothing was visible. The invisible items felt like possessions. Clothes, gear, supplies, the kind of excess possessions Robert had spent his career eliminating from clients' lives. His minimalist pack was accumulating everything he had refused to carry, everything his philosophy rejected, everything his decluttering had tried to eliminate. By day 10, the pack weighed over 60 pounds. Robert could barely carry it, was bent under the weight of invisible possessions, crushed by accumulation he couldn't see but could definitely feel. His minimalism had created such extreme emptiness that the universe was filling it forcibly, loading him with burdens whether he wanted them or not. The invisible items began affecting him beyond their weight. Robert felt cluttered despite having almost no visible possessions, felt burdened by excess despite maintaining his minimalism. The invisible accumulation was creating the same psychological effects as physical clutter, was weighing him down mentally as well as physically. He tried to sort through the invisible items to identify what he was carrying, to declutter the non-physical possessions. His hands would encounter objects in the pack, would feel their shapes and textures but couldn't grasp or remove them. The invisible items were present but untouchable, accumulated but undeclutterable. By day 12, the pack weighed over 80 pounds. Robert could no longer hike, could barely move under the weight of invisible possessions. He collapsed on the trail, crushed by accumulation he couldn't see, couldn't identify, couldn't eliminate through the decluttering practices he had spent his career perfecting. Rangers found him immobilized under his pack, which looked nearly empty but weighed more than he could carry. They tried to help him remove the pack, but even they felt the enormous weight, felt the packed density of something that wasn't visibly present. The pack was cut off of Robert, removed forcibly because he couldn't lift it himself. But within hours, Robert felt weight accumulating on his body directly, no longer needing the pack as a container. Invisible possessions were attaching themselves to him, loading onto his shoulders, his back, his body itself becoming the container for accumulation he couldn't prevent. At the hospital, doctors tried to understand the weight. Robert's actual body mass was normal, but he reported feeling crushed by enormous weight, feeling loaded with possessions he couldn't see. CT scans showed nothing unusual, but force measurements confirmed unusual pressure on his skeletal system, as if he were carrying heavy loads despite being objectively unloaded. Over weeks, the invisible weight gradually decreased, the accumulated possessions slowly dissipated, removed by whatever process had added them. Robert returned to his normal physical state, unburdened by the invisible accumulation. But psychologically, Robert was changed. He couldn't practice minimalism anymore. Every time he tried to declutter, to eliminate possessions, to reduce his belongings, he felt invisible accumulation beginning, felt the vacuum being filled with burdens he couldn't identify or control. He abandoned his decluttering consultancy, unable to help others eliminate excess when his own elimination had resulted in invisible accumulation worse than physical clutter. He lives now in deliberate messiness, maintaining visible possessions specifically to prevent invisible accumulation, keeping his spaces cluttered to avoid the vacuum that demands filling. Robert's minimalist philosophy was destroyed by the discovery that emptiness is not neutral, that elimination creates obligation to be filled, that refusing to carry things means something else will load you with burdens you cannot refuse. He had tried to reduce himself to essentials, had eliminated excess ruthlessly, had created such extreme minimalism that the universe responded by filling the vacuum forcibly, loading him with invisible possessions that weighed more and cluttered more than any physical items he had eliminated, teaching him that minimalism creates absence, and absence creates vacuum, and vacuum creates demand to be filled by visible possessions if you'll accept them, or invisible possessions if you refuse, but filled regardless because emptiness is unstable, because space abhors vacuum, and because decluttering to extreme minimalism doesn't create freedom but creates obligation to carry whatever the universe loads you with to fill the space you've emptied, whether you want it or not, whether you can see it or not, whether you can eliminate it or not, leaving you more burdened by invisible excess than you ever were by visible possessions, crushed by accumulation you created through elimination, loaded by your refusal to carry anything. Story 6. The Timeline Walker. Grace Morrison was a 33-year-old historian from Baltimore who understood time, understood chronology, understood how the past led to the present. In August 2020, while hiking through Pennsylvania, Grace took a wrong turn and found herself not lost in space but lost in time, walking a section of trail that existed in multiple decades simultaneously, where each step moved her through years rather than miles, where distance was measured in chronology rather than geography. Grace was following the trail carefully, using maps and GPS to ensure she stayed on the correct path. But at a particular junction, her GPS malfunctioned briefly, and in her confusion, Grace took a side path she thought was the AT but was actually something else, a temporal branch where the trail connected different years rather than different locations. The change was subtle at first. The forest looked slightly different. The trees were positioned oddly. The undergrowth was wrong for the season. Grace assumed she had simply entered a different microclimate or ecological zone. Then she saw a trail sign that said, Appalachian Trail, established 1937. Grace knew the AT was established in the 1920s and 30s, but seeing a sign from the actual construction era seemed impossible. The sign looked new, freshly posted, as if 1937 were the current year. Grace checked her phone for the date. It showed August 14, 2020. But the forest around her, the quality of light, the construction of the trail itself, all suggested an earlier era. She was in 2020 according to her phone, but in 1937 according to the trail. As Grace continued hiking, the temporal displacement became more obvious. She saw hikers dressed in 1930s clothing using equipment from that era, speaking in dialect and idiom from 80 years ago. They greeted her cheerfully, commenting on her strange clothes and equipment, asking about the futuristic gear she carried. Grace tried to explain that she was from 2020, that she had somehow stepped back in time. But the 1937 hikers assumed she was joking or confused, dismissed her explanation good-naturedly, and continued their own hikes through time they experienced as present. The trail itself showed temporal layering. Grace could see the path as it existed in 1937, narrower, less developed, more rugged. But she could also see transparent overlays of the trail in other years. The improved path from the 1960s, the relocated sections from the 1980s, the current 2020 route. All the timelines existed simultaneously, occupying the same space but separated by temporal rather than spatial distance. Grace realized she was walking through time as well as space. Each step forward moved her through years, covering temporal distance while also covering geographical distance. She was hiking through chronology, traversing decades with every mile. By evening, Grace had walked from 1937 to 1951. The forest showed seasonal changes that represented years rather than months. The trail showed modifications from different decades. Hikers she encountered existed in their respective eras, unaware they were sharing space with people from other times. Grace tried to navigate back to 2020 to return to her proper timeline. but the temporal trail didn't have clear markers indicating which direction led to which year. She could walk forward through time or backward through time, but she couldn't identify which direction was which without hiking and observing the changes. She walked through the 1960s, through the 1970s, through the 1980s and 1990s. Each era had its characteristic hikers, its particular trail conditions, its specific equipment and culture. Grace was a ghost moving through decades, an anachronism in every timeline, belonging to none of them. By the third day, Grace had walked through the entire late 20th century and into the early 21st. She saw herself, or rather, she saw other hikers who were her chronological contemporaries, people from 2020 hiking the trail in their present. Unaware they were sharing space with Grace, who was temporally displaced, experiencing their present as a destination she was walking toward through time. Grace tried to synchronize with her proper timeline, to step from the temporal trail back into normal time. But she couldn't find the junction. The temporal branch had no clear exit, no way to leave the chronology trail and return to the geography trail. She continued walking, now moving forward from 2020 into future years. The trail showed what it would become, modifications planned but not yet executed, reroutes scheduled for coming decades, hikers from future years walking the AT in times Grace would never normally experience. In 2025, Grace saw trail improvements that hadn't happened yet in her original 2020. In 2030, she saw hikers using technology that didn't exist when she started her hike. In 2040, she saw herself again, an older version hiking the AT as an elderly woman, unaware that her younger self was watching from the temporal trail. Grace was unstuck in time, walking through decades, unable to return to her proper chronology. She existed in all years simultaneously, a temporal wanderer on a trail that connected times rather than places, hiking through history and future with no way to exit back into normal time. Rangers in 2020 received reports of a hiker matching Grace's description appearing at various trail sections years apart, seen in 2020, then spotted in 2015, then encountered in 2025. The reports were dismissed as cases of mistaken identity, but some rangers suspected something stranger was occurring. Grace continues walking the temporal trail, aging normally but moving through years abnormally. She has walked forward to 2050, backward to 1925, covering decades of chronology while covering relatively little geography. She exists in temporal transit, permanently displaced from normal time, hiking through years instead of miles, measuring her progress in decades rather than days. Other hikers occasionally see her, a woman in clothing from the wrong era, carrying equipment from the wrong decade, speaking about times that haven't happened yet or haven't happened recently. Most dismiss her as confused or eccentric, but some recognize her as the timeline walker, the hiker who took a wrong turn in 2020 and ended up lost. Not in space, but in time, walking through chronology on a trail that connects years, covering temporal distance with each step, unable to exit back into normal time. Unable to stop walking through decades, unable to synchronize with any single timeline and stay there. Condemned to eternal temporal transit, experiencing all years but belonging to none. Hiking forever through the history and future of the Appalachian Trail. A ghost in every timeline, present in all decades, trapped in temporal displacement that makes her a permanent anachronism. Story 7. The Lightness. Carl Zimmerman was a 48-year-old physics teacher from Chicago who understood gravity, understood mass, understood weight and force. In October 2016, while hiking through North Carolina, Carl began to feel lighter. Not in the emotional sense, but in the literal physical sense. His body weight was decreasing. His gravitational pull was weakening. His mass was somehow reducing without losing body tissue. What Carl discovered was that weight is not as fixed as physics claims, that mass can decrease independent of matter, and that becoming too light means floating away, drifting up into atmosphere like a helium balloon, rising until you reach altitude where humans cannot survive. Carl noticed the change on his third day. His pack felt lighter than it should, his body felt more buoyant, his footsteps felt less grounded. He weighed himself using his portable scale, showed 165 pounds, his normal weight. But he felt like he weighed less, felt lighter than the scale indicated. By day 4, the feeling had intensified. Carl felt like he weighed perhaps 150 pounds despite the scale showing unchanged 165. His body was lighter than its mass, was experiencing reduced gravitational pull despite having the same amount of matter. Carl tried to understand this physically. Mass and weight were related through gravity. Weight equaled mass times gravitational acceleration. If his weight was decreasing without mass changing, then either his mass was actually decreasing despite scale readings, or local gravity was weakening, or some force was counteracting gravity. By day 5, Carl was having trouble staying grounded. His steps would launch him into the air slightly, his body would lift when wind blew, his contact with the ground felt tenuous. He was becoming buoyant, floating like he was in water, drifting upward whenever force pressed downward. The scale still showed 165 pounds, his mass was unchanged according to objective measurement, but his experienced weight was maybe 120 pounds and dropping. The disconnect between measured mass and experienced weight was widening. Carl tried adding weight to stay grounded, carrying rocks, loading his pack heavier. But the additional mass also became light, also experienced reduced weight, also failed to anchor him. Whatever was making him lighter affected everything he carried, reduced all his weight proportionally. By day 6, Carl's experienced weight was perhaps 80 pounds. He could barely stay on the ground, would lift off with each step, would drift upward before gravity pulled him back down. He was becoming unmoored from Earth, was losing the gravitational bond that kept him grounded. Other hikers noticed his strange movement, the way he seemed to bounce and float, the way he drifted slightly above the trail. They assumed he was deliberately jumping or hopping, thought his movement was intentional rather than involuntary. Carl tried to explain that he was becoming weightless, that his mass was somehow disconnecting from gravitational force. But no one understood. No one believed that weight could decrease independent of mass, that gravity could release someone while leaving them physically intact. By day 7, Carl's experienced weight was perhaps 40 pounds. He could no longer walk normally, would lift off the ground with each step and drift several yards before descending. He was effectively floating. His connection to Earth maintained only by occasional contact when gravity briefly reasserted itself. Carl tied himself to trees, anchored himself with rope, tried to prevent himself from floating away. But the lightness continued increasing, the weight continuing decreasing, approaching zero. By day 8, Carl was weightless. He lifted off the ground and didn't come back down, drifted upward into the forest canopy, floated like a helium balloon released into atmosphere. He was still alive, still had mass according to physics, but experienced zero weight, zero gravitational pull, zero connection to Earth. Carl drifted upward through the trees, caught briefly in branches before the wind would free him and he would continue rising. He watched the ground recede below him, watched the forest become smaller, watched himself float away from the planet that had kept him grounded his entire life. He tried to swim downward, to propel himself back toward Earth, but had no traction, no way to generate downward force. He was at the mercy of air currents, drifting upward, rising toward atmosphere where oxygen would become thin and temperature would drop and human survival would become impossible. Carl rose for hours, drifting on wind, ascending toward altitude no human should reach without aircraft or protective equipment. He felt cold increasing, air thinning, pressure decreasing. He was heading toward space, toward the edge of atmosphere, toward altitude that would kill him through cold and hypoxia. At approximately 30,000 feet, Carl's ascent stopped. Some balance was reached between his remaining weight and atmospheric buoyancy. He stabilized at altitude, drifting horizontally now rather than vertically, floating at the edge of survivable atmosphere. Carl survived there for 3 days, cold, hypoxic, barely conscious, drifting on high-altitude winds. His body adapted partly, his respiration slowed, his metabolism decreased, his consciousness faded to minimal awareness. Weather patterns eventually brought him lower. A downdraft pushed him toward Earth, descending him back through atmosphere. Carl drifted downward, still weightless but no longer rising, floating toward ground like a feather falling in still air. He landed in Virginia, hundreds of miles from where he had lifted off, deposited gently on the ground after days of floating at lethal altitude. His body was damaged by the exposure, frostbite, tissue damage from hypoxia, dehydration, starvation. But he was alive, had survived floating away from Earth. Medical teams found his condition baffling, injuries consistent with high-altitude exposure despite being at sea level, metabolic changes suggesting days without food or oxygen, physical damage from extreme cold. But no explanation for how he reached such altitude or survived it. Carl's weight slowly returned to normal over weeks. The lightness receded, gravitational pull reasserted itself, his mass reconnected to Earth. But he retained lingering buoyancy, a tendency to feel slightly lighter than he should, to drift upward slightly when relaxed. He never hiked again. He stays indoors primarily, afraid that going into wilderness would trigger the lightness again, would cause him to float away again, would send him drifting toward atmosphere where he would die from exposure before weather brought him back down. Carl tried to warn other hikers about the phenomenon, about weight that decreases independent of mass, about becoming so light you float away. But his story sounds like delusional thinking, like fantasy, like impossible physics. He knows it's real because he lived it, because he floated to 30,000 feet and survived, because he spent 3 days drifting at the edge of atmosphere, weightless but not massless, subject to wind but not to gravity, rising until altitude would have killed him if weather hadn't pushed him back down. Sometimes Carl feels the lightness beginning again, feels his weight decreasing, feels gravitational pull weakening. When this happens, he lies down, spreads his arms and legs, maximizes his contact with ground, trying to maintain connection to Earth, trying to prevent himself from floating away again, afraid of rising toward atmosphere that would kill him, afraid of becoming so light that gravity releases him completely, afraid of drifting away from Earth forever, floating upward until altitude and cold and lack of oxygen end him. A physics teacher who learned that weight is more flexible than textbooks claim, that gravity can release you, that mass can disconnect from gravitational force, and that becoming too light means floating away. Story 8. The Last Words. Patricia Winters was a 45-year-old speech pathologist from Seattle who understood language, who had spent 20 years helping people communicate, who valued words and their power. In April 2018, while hiking through Tennessee, Patricia spoke her last words, not because she was dying, but because language itself stopped working for her. She could still speak, could still form sounds, but the words had no meaning, carried no communication, connected to nothing. What Patricia discovered was that language can abandon you, that words can become empty sounds, and that losing communication while retaining speech leaves you more isolated than silence ever could. Patricia was an avid hiker and constant talker. She narrated her experiences aloud, talked to herself while hiking, verbally processed her thoughts and observations. Language was her constant companion, her tool for understanding the world. On the third day, while describing a beautiful view aloud, Patricia noticed the words sounded strange. Not her voice. That remained normal. But the words themselves felt empty, felt like mere sounds without meaning, without connection to the concepts they should represent. She said beautiful again, trying to reconnect the word to the vista before her. But the word was just a sound, beautiful syllables without meaning, acoustic patterns without semantic content. The word had become detached from its meaning, had lost its connection to the concept it should communicate. Patricia tried other words, describing what she saw in different terms. But every word was empty, was just sound, was acoustic noise without carrying meaning. Language was still available to her. She could produce words perfectly. But the words had become meaningless, had lost their communicative function. She tried reading, opened her guidebook and looked at words she had read hundreds of times. The text was readable in the sense that she could parse the letters and identify the words. But the words conveyed nothing, meant nothing, connected to no concepts or ideas. Language had become arbitrary sound patterns divorced from meaning. Patricia's speech pathology training provided no framework for this. She understood aphasia, understood language disorders, understood how brain damage could impair communication. But her brain was functioning normally. She could think clearly, could understand concepts, could perceive the world accurately. Only language had stopped working, had become meaningless while remaining technically functional. By day 4, Patricia couldn't communicate at all despite being able to speak perfectly. When she encountered other hikers and tried to talk, she would produce fluent sentences that sounded normal but carried no meaning. The words were empty sounds. The sentences were acoustic patterns without semantic content. Other hikers would respond to her, speaking words that Patricia could hear but couldn't understand. Language incoming was as meaningless as language outgoing. She heard the sounds, parsed the phonemes, identified the words, but derived no meaning from them. Communication had broken down completely while speech remained intact. Patricia tried to communicate non-verbally, using gestures and expressions. But visual communication was also empty. She could see gestures but couldn't interpret them, could make expressions but couldn't imbue them with meaning. All communication channels had failed, leaving her isolated despite having functional speech and normal sensory input. She tried writing, thinking perhaps written language would retain meaning when spoken language had lost it. But words on paper were as empty as words in air, marks without meaning, symbols without reference, writing that communicated nothing despite being grammatically correct and visually clear. Patricia was experiencing complete semantic aphasia without any neurological damage. Meaning itself had abandoned her, had disconnected from language and left her with empty forms, words without definitions, sentences without messages, communication without content. By day 5, Patricia stopped trying to communicate. She hiked in silence, not because she couldn't speak, but because speaking was meaningless, was producing empty sounds that conveyed nothing, was creating the appearance of communication without any actual communication occurring. She continued hiking toward her planned endpoint, navigating by maps whose text was meaningless but whose visual elements remained interpretable. She could see trails and elevations, could understand spatial relationships, could navigate geography. Only language had failed, only semantic meaning had abandoned her. Patricia reached a road and flagged down a car. The driver spoke to her, asked questions, tried to help. Patricia could hear the sounds but derived no meaning, responded with her own meaningless sounds that happened to be grammatically correct English sentences. They communicated through gestures and shared intent without actual language working for either of them in interaction with her. At the hospital, doctors tried to assess her condition. Patricia could speak fluently, could write clearly, could read words aloud perfectly. But comprehension testing showed complete failure. She understood nothing anyone said, conveyed nothing when she spoke, despite producing language that was structurally perfect. Neurological tests showed no damage. Brain scans were normal. Patricia's language systems were physically intact. But functionally, they had lost connection to meaning, had become pure form without content, had been reduced to empty acoustic and visual patterns that conveyed nothing. Months of speech therapy provided no improvement. The disconnect between language and meaning was absolute and permanent. Patricia could still speak and read and write, could still produce perfect grammatical sentences, could still use language flawlessly in structural terms. But the words were empty. The sentences were meaningless. The language conveyed nothing. She stopped working as a speech pathologist, obviously unable to help patients communicate when she had lost communication herself. She lives now in functional silence, surrounded by language that sounds normal but means nothing, isolated despite being able to speak, alone despite being fluent, trapped in a world where words are just sounds and sentences are just patterns and language is just empty form without semantic content. Patricia tried to warn others about the experience through writing, but her written warnings are as meaningless as her speech. Perfectly formed sentences that convey nothing. Grammatically correct paragraphs that communicate no content. Language that appears normal but carries no meaning. Other hikers occasionally report similar temporary experiences, words losing meaning briefly, language feeling empty for a few minutes or hours. But for Patricia, the loss was permanent, complete, irreversible. Language abandoned her on that Tennessee trail and never returned, leaving her with words that work structurally but fail semantically, with speech that sounds normal but communicates nothing, with language that is empty form, meaningless sound, pure structure without content, proving that words can become divorced from meaning. That language can lose its connection to concepts, that communication can fail while speech remains intact, and that the loss of semantic function leaves you more isolated than the loss of speech ever could. Trapped in a world full of language that means nothing, surrounded by words that are just sounds, producing sentences that are just patterns, living in perpetual non-communication despite perfect linguistic form. Forever speaking without saying anything, forever hearing without understanding anything, forever reading without comprehending anything, isolated by language itself, alone in a world of meaningless words. Story 9. The Finder. Lucas Martin was a 39-year-old private investigator from Boston who specialized in finding things, missing persons, lost items, hidden assets. He had an exceptional talent for discovery, for uncovering what was concealed, for finding what others couldn't locate. In July 2017, while hiking through Vermont, Lucas found something he wasn't looking for, a discovery that marked him as a finder, that made him magnetic to lost things, and that caused everything that was missing or hidden to try to be found by him, to gravitate toward him, to burden him with responsibility for discovering things that should stay lost. Lucas wasn't looking for anything specific on his hike. This was meant to be a vacation from finding, a break from discovery, a chance to walk without searching. But his finder nature was too deeply ingrained, too much a part of his identity to be left behind. On the second day, while hiking past a large boulder, Lucas noticed something hidden beneath it, a small metal box concealed in a gap under the rock. He hadn't been looking for it, hadn't been searching, but he found it anyway because finding was what he did. The box contained old photographs, letters, and a journal from the 1970s. Someone had hidden these items decades ago, had deliberately concealed them. Lucas had discovered them accidentally, had found what someone had intended to stay lost. He continued hiking, intending to report the find to rangers. But throughout the day, Lucas kept finding things, lost items from other hikers, objects that had fallen beside the trail, possessions that had been misplaced or abandoned. His path took him past discovery after discovery, as if lost things were attracting him, were positioning themselves where he would find them. By evening, Lucas had found over 20 items: lost knives, dropped water bottles, misplaced clothing, abandoned gear. He carried what he could, left the rest marked for their owners to reclaim. But the discoveries kept occurring, kept appearing in his path, kept demanding to be found by him. That night at the shelter, other hikers mentioned things they had lost during their hikes. Lucas had found several of them could return items to their owners. But each return seemed to strengthen something, seemed to mark him more clearly as a finder, seemed to establish his role as the person who discovered lost things. By day 3, the findings were no longer limited to physical objects. Lucas began finding information, overheard conversations that revealed secrets, witnessed interactions that exposed hidden relationships, observed details that uncovered concealed truths. He was finding things that weren't objects, finding knowledge that was hidden, finding truths that were meant to stay concealed. By day 4, Lucas was finding things that didn't want to be found. He would encounter hiding people who fled at his approach, would discover concealed locations that disappeared after he saw them, would stumble onto secrets that caused problems when discovered. His finding ability had become compulsive, uncontrollable, revealing things that should stay hidden. The burden of finding was overwhelming. Lucas couldn't walk without discovering, couldn't rest without uncovering, couldn't exist without revealing. Lost things gravitated toward him. Hidden things positioned themselves in his path. Secrets exposed themselves to him whether he sought them or not. By day 5, Lucas was finding things that were dangerous to discover. He found evidence of crimes, found hidden sites that someone had violently protected, found secrets that people had killed to conceal. His finding was putting him in danger because lost things included things that were hidden for good reasons, things that were meant to stay concealed for safety. Lucas tried to stop finding, tried to walk without looking, tried to ignore the discoveries. But finding was involuntary now, automatic, beyond his control. His eyes would catch hidden items, his path would cross concealed locations, his attention would be drawn to secrets despite his efforts to avoid discovery. By day 6, lost people began finding Lucas. People who had deliberately disappeared, people who were hiding from something, people who had chosen to be lost. They were drawn to him, appeared in his path, revealed themselves to him because he was a finder, and they were lost, and finders and lost things gravitate toward each other. These people were desperate, running from danger, hiding from threats. They didn't want to be found, hadn't chosen to reveal themselves, but Lucas's finder nature pulled them from concealment, forced them into discovery against their will. Lucas tried to leave the trail, to escape the finding compulsion. But everywhere he went, he found things. Lost items in the parking area, hidden evidence along the road, missing persons in the town he evacuated to. The trail had marked him as a finder, had amplified his natural ability into uncontrollable compulsion, had made him magnetic to everything lost or hidden. He returned to Boston, hoping familiar environment would reduce the finding. But discovery only intensified. He found lost items constantly, uncovered hidden information everywhere, exposed secrets in every situation. His private investigation work became unwanted, clients disturbed by how much he discovered, how many secrets he exposed beyond what they hired him to find. Lucas stopped working as an investigator, unable to control what he found, unable to limit discovery to what was requested. But the finding continued. In grocery stores, he would find lost children. In restaurants, he would discover hidden affairs. On streets, he would encounter missing persons who had deliberately disappeared. The burden of finding everything became unbearable. Lucas couldn't walk without discovering, couldn't exist without exposing, couldn't be anywhere without finding what was lost or hidden there. He had become a magnetic pole for discovery, a gravitational center that pulled lost things from concealment. He tried to help when he found things, tried to return lost items and assist missing persons. But many things stayed lost for good reasons. Many secrets remained hidden to protect people. Many disappeared persons chose to be missing. His forced discoveries caused harm as often as they helped. Lucas lives now in isolation, trying to minimize his finding, trying to reduce discovery by reducing exposure. He stays in his apartment, limits his movement, avoids public spaces where lost things might gravitate toward him. But even in isolation, lost things find him. Mail delivered to wrong addresses ends up at his door. Missing pets appear on his doorstep. People who are hiding knock on his window seeking help. They didn't consciously choose to request. He is trapped by his finder nature, by the amplification that occurred on the trail, by the marking that made him magnetic to everything lost or hidden. He cannot stop finding because finding is what he is, has become his inescapable identity, his permanent burden, his inescapable function. Lucas warns other investigators, other people with natural finding ability to be careful in wilderness, to resist the urge to discover on the trail, to leave lost things lost rather than finding them, because finding marks you, because discovery establishes identity, and because becoming known as a finder means everything lost will gravitate toward you. Everything hidden will expose itself to you. Everything that wants to stay concealed will reveal itself to you whether you seek it or not, burdening you with responsibility for discoveries you never chose to make, for secrets you never wanted to know, for lost things that gravitate toward you because you found something once and became forever marked as the finder. Story 10. The Last Hiker. Emma Richardson was a 29-year-old epidemiologist from Denver who understood population dynamics, understood how communities formed and sustained themselves, understood the mathematics of groups. In September 2022, while attempting a through hike of the AT, Emma noticed the number of other hikers declining steadily. Fewer people at shelters, fewer encounters on the trail, fewer through hikers attempting the journey. What Emma discovered was that she was witnessing population decline in real time, that the number of AT hikers was approaching zero, and that she was hiking toward the inevitable moment when she would be the last hiker, the final person walking the trail, alone in a wilderness that had once been populated but was now approaching abandonment. Emma started her through hike in April, joining the usual wave of northbound hikers attempting the trail. The first weeks were crowded, shelters full, trail register thick with entries, constant encounters with other hikers. The trail felt vibrant, populated, alive with human activity. But by late May, Emma noticed the crowds thinning. Fewer hikers at shelters, fewer entries in registers, fewer encounters on the trail. She assumed people were quitting, that the normal attrition of through hikers was occurring as the less committed abandoned their attempts. By June, the decline was more noticeable. Emma encountered perhaps 5 other hikers per day, down from the dozens she had seen daily in April and May. Shelter registers showed fewer entries, towns showed fewer through hikers, the trail felt less populated. Emma's epidemiological training made her track this decline quantitatively. She logged the number of hikers encountered daily, counted register entries, estimated the total population still on the trail. The numbers showed steady decline, predictable, mathematical, following a curve that suggested complete depopulation within months. By July, Emma was encountering 2 or 3 other hikers per day. The trail felt empty, abandoned, as if the human population was disappearing. She checked with trail angels and hostel operators. They confirmed that through hiker numbers were down dramatically, that far fewer people were attempting the trail this year than in previous years. But Emma's data showed something more disturbing. The decline wasn't random attrition, it was systematic reduction. following a mathematical curve that suggested purposeful depopulation rather than natural dropout rates. The number of hikers was decreasing too steadily, too predictably, following a population model that looked like planned extinction rather than voluntary abandonment. By August, Emma was encountering perhaps one other hiker every 2 days. The trail was nearly empty, shelters were unused, trail registers showed days between entries. The AT was becoming depopulated, approaching 0 humans, heading toward complete abandonment. Emma considered quitting, joining the exodus, abandoning the trail like everyone else seemed to be doing. But her scientific curiosity kept her going. She wanted to understand the population decline, wanted to track the curve to its endpoint, wanted to see what happened when the number of hikers reached 0. By September, Emma hadn't seen another hiker in over a week. Trail registers showed no recent entries. Shelters were empty, towns were devoid of through hikers. She appeared to be alone on the trail, the last person still attempting a through hike, the final hiker in a population approaching extinction. Emma's mathematical models predicted she would become the last hiker, the final person on the AT by late September. The curve was clear, the trend was undeniable. The population was reaching 0 with her as the sole remaining individual. She reached Maine as the last hiker, walked through the 100-mile wilderness seeing no one, encountered no other humans for days at a time. The trail was abandoned, depopulated, returned to wilderness as the human presence approached 0. Emma felt the weight of being last, of being the final representative of a population facing extinction. When she completed the trail, there would be no more through hikers, no more human presence, no more activity on the AT. The trail would be empty, would exist without hikers, would return to the pre-human state it had before the AT was established. As Emma approached Katahdin, she realized the implication of being the last hiker. When she summited, when she completed her through hike, the population would reach 0. There would be no one left attempting the trail, no one following behind her, no new hikers starting in Georgia. The AT would be depopulated completely, would exist without humans, would be abandoned. Emma climbed Katahdin as the last hiker, reached the summit as the final person completing the AT. She touched the sign as the last of her kind, the final member of a population reaching extinction. And as she descended, Emma understood that she couldn't leave, couldn't exit the trail, couldn't abandon the AT because she was the last one, and if she left, the population would reach 0 completely and the trail would be truly abandoned, truly empty, truly without human presence. She tried to descend from Katahdin to complete her hike and leave the trail, but she found herself unable to depart, unable to exit, held by the responsibility of being last. If she left, who would maintain the human presence? If she departed, who would keep the population above 0? If she abandoned the trail, it would be truly empty, truly depopulated, truly extinct of human activity. Emma remains on the trail, has been there for over a year now, hiking sections repeatedly, maintaining human presence, keeping the population at 1 instead of 0. She is the last hiker, the final person on the AT, the sole representative of a depopulated community. She survives through trail angels who supply her, through towns that provide food, through her own determination to maintain presence. She hikes north to south and south to north, covering the trail repeatedly, ensuring that at least one person is always there, that the population never reaches 0. Other hikers occasionally start attempts, try to join Emma on the trail, but they always quit, always abandon, always leave until Emma is alone again. The last one, the final person maintaining human presence on an otherwise abandoned trail. Emma has stopped trying to understand why the population declined, why everyone else left, why she's the last one. She knows only that she cannot leave, cannot let the number reach 0, cannot abandon the trail to complete emptiness, She is bound by being last, held by the responsibility of maintaining population above extinction, trapped in the role of final hiker on a trail that everyone else has abandoned. She walks alone through wilderness that was once populated, past shelters that once held communities, through towns that once welcomed crowds of thru-hikers. She is the last of her kind, the final member of a population facing extinction, the sole person keeping the Appalachian Trail from complete human abandonment. Hiking forever because leaving would mean zero, because departing would mean extinction, because abandoning the trail would mean the population has ended completely. Leaving the AT empty, depopulated, returned to pure wilderness without human presence, without hikers, without the community that once made the trail alive with activity and now exists only in Emma, the last hiker, walking forever through abandoned trail because someone has to maintain presence, someone has to keep the population above zero, someone has to ensure the AT doesn't become completely empty of humanity, even if that someone is alone, is last, is the final person walking a trail that everyone else has left behind.